We kick off this evening with our top story tonight. For centuries, many Christians in Muslim-majority countries lived side by side in peace with their neighbours. But in recent times, we're seeing a mass exodus across the Middle East as many Christians no longer feel welcome or even safe in their own homeland. We begin this part of the show with a report from Richard Green.
Across much of the world, 2010 has been a bad year for Christians. In Egypt, protests over plans to build a church leave a Christian dead. In Iran, a pastor sentenced to death for converting from Islam to Christianity. And there's more, from Morocco to Afghanistan.
The worst place of all, undoubtedly, is Iraq, where there was a recent church bombing. But we've also seen church attacks and village attacks in Egypt. We saw the deportation of scores of Christians in the relatively moderate country of Morocco. There's a Christian pastor on death row for apostasy in Iran. And in Pakistan now, for the first time, a Christian woman has been condemned to death for blasphemy.
Pakistan's president says he won't let her be executed, but her case could be tied up in court for years. Nina Shea says the rise of extremism in the Middle East is one of the reasons for the upsurge in violence. Religious freedom expert Leonard Leo says another problem is that governments aren't punishing people for attacking Christians.
If you're not going to enforce the law, people are going to engage in violent behavior.
In many countries, Christians, vastly outnumbered, can't defend themselves from terrorists, militias, or their own neighbors. And many of them have had enough.
Christians are packing up and leaving, and we've seen this in Iraq, where the population has been cut in half since 2003. It's now down to about 500,000 people. We've seen this in Egypt as well. Lebanon is a place that was majority Christian until a couple decades ago. It's now down to a third of the population. The Christian population in Iran has dwindled down. Throughout the entire region, there's probably no more than 15 million Christians.
Christians aren't the only ones suffering. Religious minorities like Shia Muslims and the Baha'i are also facing persecution. But Christians are one of the largest minorities in the Middle East, and this year, many of them won't be having a Merry Christmas. Richard Green, CNN, London.
Overview there of the threats facing Christians in the Middle East, but the persecution and discrimination stretch far beyond those borders to places like Pakistan. We asked three of our reporters to update us on this situation where they work and live. Have listened to this.
I'm Jumana Karachi in Baghdad. Like most of Iraq's minority groups, the Christians have not been spared the bloodshed of the past 7 years. But the recent violence that started with that horrific siege of a Baghdad church in October that killed and injured dozens of Christians didn't stop there. Christians have found themselves being targeted in their own homes. Now, it was a group affiliated with Al-Qaeda that claimed the church siege and promised the Christians more attacks. Members of the community say that their lives have been paralyzed by fear, that they're almost housebound. Before the U.S.-led invasion in 2003, Iraq is estimated to have had more than 1 million Christians, but the violence and persecution that followed drove about half of them out. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, thousands of Christians have fled their homes in Baghdad and the northern city of Mosul in recent weeks as a direct result of the church siege and the other attacks. Most of those have gone to the country's Kurdish north, a relatively secure part of the country, while others have sought refuge in neighboring countries. UNHCR describes this as a slow but steady exodus, raising concerns that the renewed violence and inadequate protection may just drive Iraq's remaining Christians out.
I'm Paula Hancox in Bethlehem. Thousands of Christians from across the world will be coming here to this city this week to see the place where Jesus is believed to have been born. But life is difficult for Palestinian Christians who actually live here. Many have moved away already. Back in 1948, 80% of this city was Christian. That percentage is now just 35%. Now, a small number say that there are some tensions between Muslims and Christians here in the West Bank, but others say the main reason for moving away is the building of what Israel calls its security barrier, what the Palestinians call the separation wall, and a land grab. It currently surrounds Bethlehem on 3 sides. It's cut off the economy from Jerusalem. Unemployment is very high, and Christians here in Bethlehem need to have a special permit to be able to visit Jerusalem, just a 10-minute drive down the road. In Gaza, things are even more difficult for Christians. Just 3,000 Christians remain in the Gaza Strip. Many say that they were leaving because of fears of attacks by Islamic extremists, and others say they're leaving because of Israel's blockade on Gaza.
I'm Chris Lawrence in Islamabad, and as you can see from some of the Christmas decorations, Christians actually make up a little less than 2% of the population here in Pakistan. In some of the more highly educated urban areas, their life isn't that bad, but for most of the rest of the population, it's tough and getting tougher, mainly because of Pakistan's blasphemy law, which allows Christians to be prosecuted for all kinds of crimes against the state religion of Islam. Probably the most famous of these is Asiya Bibi, a Roman Catholic mother of 2 who remains in prison and scheduled to be executed for blaspheming against the Prophet Muhammad. Already, a cleric has offered thousands of dollars of reward for anyone who kills her, and the Taliban have promised retribution if the government spares her life. And she's not alone. These charges are actually on the rise. Just last year, well over 100 people were charged with blasphemy here in Pakistan. Chris Lawrence, CNN, Islamabad.
All right, well, lest we forget, the Quran, of course, has great respect for Jesus, referring to him as a prophet and a messenger of God, and even devoting an entire chapter to his mother Mary. So what is behind all this hostility towards Christians then, and what can the world do about it? Well, we're joined now by Fayaz Mughal, who's the founder of Faith Matters, and Andy Dipper, CEO of Release International. I think we should begin, chaps, by saying that this isn't a question of Muslims against Christians by any stretch of the imagination, is it, Andy?
No, absolutely not. I mean, around the world today, many minorities are being persecuted by another majority. It just so happens in the countries that we've considered just now, in Pakistan, the sizable Christian minority is being persecuted. But actually it's the laws, and let's perhaps unpack that in a little while, but it's the laws that are being used unfairly to abuse the minorities. And
we will talk about that. Let's start off by asking Fayaz who you think is doing the persecuting at this point.
I mean, clearly there are a number of factors, and they're quite complex factors. We've mentioned the issue of laws and the implementation of laws. There is also clearly the issue of extremism on the agenda. Groups that are manipulating the lack of security in some of these countries to effectively create a base for them. And that base means if they attack the minority, they have some kind of resonance with the wider majority. And that's the kind of politicization we're seeing here. And so we have groups that are fractured within countries that are undertaking these attacks. We have a lack of laws being implemented. And occasionally we have politicians who see this as a quick win situation. And I think that's a number of factors.
But also, of course, it's very much a family level and a community level. It's not just state-sponsored or even state-permitted. It happens, extrajudicial killings are very widespread throughout the world, and that is one of the biggest problems actually for minorities around the world today.
Let's remind ourselves, Pakistan, about 2 million Christians, slightly over 1% of the population. Egypt, about 10% of the population. Iraq, we're looking at less than 500,000 Christians at this point, less than 2% of the population. Afghanistan, for example, also in the region, a few thousand Christians. So is this getting worse at this point, Andy?
It's very clear that we are finding out more and more stories. It's difficult to sometimes assess, year on year, is it getting worse? We're seeing more cases. So on one level, it is getting worse because we're being made aware of more cases. And the tragedy is that actually people are being treated incredibly harshly. The assumptions that people are something that they're not is on the increase. There's a polarisation in the views.
How much damage, Fayaz, has the global geopolitical agenda, widely perceived, of course, as the West versus Muslim around the world, done to these congregations? Is that where the damage is?
I mean, I think that a lot of the issue is the damage around geopolitical issues. It clearly is. I mean, look at the situation with Iraq as a prime example where an invasion's taken place, and actually, throughout the last 8, 9, 10 years, security has been on and off, tenuous, and there have been ups and downs in terms of security in that country. Geopolitics plays a big role in Lebanon. Lebanon was mentioned earlier. It's a big role in Lebanon. There are many players around the region trying to manipulate where Lebanon goes in the region, very clearly. Pakistan, there are geopolitics in Pakistan. There are different regions which also vie for resources. So I think geopolitics plays a major role, but on the war on terror, the global war on terror has effectively, in many ways, trying to reinforce these identities.
What, for want of a better word, does Christian HQ do to protect its congregations?
Well, of course, there is no single Christian HQ. It's very much a belief system that goes all around the world.
But there are people running organisations.
But the whole approach, really, of Christians all around the world isn't actually to adopt a protectionist stance where they would have armed guards or they would fight back in any way. You know, the whole purpose of Christianity is it's a peace-loving religion. It's about drawing people to the love of Jesus. That's what Christmas is all about. And that is the DNA of Christianity. And that is what really is perhaps the greatest vulnerability to Christians, because there are people out there that exploit that vulnerability.
We talked at the beginning of the 21st century, sadly post 9/11, about a clash of civilizations. Are we seeing the evidence of that now on the streets of Cairo and Islamabad and Baghdad?
I don't believe that is the case, and I don't believe that's the case for a number of reasons. There are numerous projects. What we don't see on the newswires are numerous projects where Christians and Muslim theologians, leaders, community leaders are trying to come together and coming together to try to keep communities together. So there's a lot of work at civil society level that's taking place in Cairo, in Syria, in a lot of the countries in the region to try to keep communities together. And I think that is the threads and those are the threads and the fibres that are keeping things going. I don't think there is a clash. However, we all need to be aware that geopolitics is driving positions which are slowly but surely can become polarised but also quite rigid. And so I think there needs to be greater investment in civil society work that ensures that actually people can be exposed to different narratives, can be exposed to different communities, and actually this is a positive thing for communities.
Is this a watershed moment, do you think?
Well, I think this is the opportunity that actually all elements of society have to speak up. You know, Pakistan, taking that particular country as an instance, there are certain elements within Pakistani culture. The reformers want to be able to, they want to abolish laws that have been used to mistreat minorities. But there are hardliners that want to reinforce those laws. There are some people that want to take Sharia law and twist it into something that it's not. So this is the time, actually, for the moderate intellectual voice, if you like, to understand the context and to speak out. What we should not do is allow fringe elements within societies to hijack the mainstream agenda.
We're going to have to leave it there, guys. Fascinating stuff. We thank you very much indeed for coming in.